Hi and welcome to the EnQueer Festival. Thanks for joining us today. We're here to talk about lesbian visibility and in particular the impact of social media on lesbians and queer women. So let me ask our audience first, do you listen to The Girl in Red? Because if you do, then it turns out you're a lesbian. And if you know what I'm talking about, or if you've ever fallen into what's known as a lesbian thirst trap, then you're almost certainly on TikTok, a video sharing app that's been downloaded over 2.6 billion times. So with the rise of lesbian content on TikTok and also the vast number of lesbian meme accounts on Instagram, these kind of digital spaces appear to be offering a safe place for queer women to express their identities. And as lesbians, we've seldom had the platform to tell our own story in our own words. So what impact does this have on lesbian visibility and the positive representation of our lives? We're here today to ask, has social media succeeded where other more traditional platforms have failed? And I'm honoured and very excited to introduce our incredible panel of writers today. So Rebecca Jessen, so her work has been published across Australia and internationally. She's an award-winning author of verse novel Gap, published in 2014. And her debut poetry collection, Ask Me About the Future, was shortlisted for the 2021 Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Poetry and the Kenneth Slessor Prize for Poetry. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Technology, and her research focuses on the intersection of contemporary Australian poetry and the expression of lesbian identity on digital media. So particularly appropriate for the subject of this panel, and it was in fact the inspiration for this panel. So really excited to have you here, Rebecca. Thank you. Our next panelist is Laura McPhee-Browne. She's a bisexual writer, social worker, and counsellor. Her debut novel, Cherry Beach, was published in 2020, and her second novel, Little Plum, is forthcoming in 2023. Her short fiction and creative nonfiction have been published widely in Australia, and she's currently working on her third book, Blue, a novella about bisexuality and infidelity. So welcome, Laura. It's really great to have you with us. So Rima Martens, welcome. Rima's a queer Australian Maori woman who is proud to dedicate her life to living in alignment with the earth, which she is reflected both in her poetry and her legal career. In 2021, she completed a mentorship under Brooke Emery through the Australian Association of Authors to produce a full-length manuscript of her poetry. Her writing has been published by LOI Journal, The Quarry, Running Dog, and in the digital collection of Emerge of the Emerging Writers Festival. So welcome, Rima. And finally, we have Sophia Davidson Gluyas. I'm so sorry. I did ask Sophia before how to pronounce her surname, and then I feel like I just butchered it. So Sophia Davidson Gluyas is a writer, director, producer, and recreational scholar. Sophia's theatrical work includes Haunted Hoey for the Surrey Hills Festival, Sillage, again for the Surrey Hills Festival and the Sydney Fringe Festival, and The Bed Party, which was performed at the Old 505 Theatre in Sydney Mardi Gras. In 2020, Sophia developed Tell Me Something as part of the Maragon Theatre Company's Playwright Program and was awarded a Northern Beaches Council Creative Community Support Grant to present a staged reading of this work. The Bed Party was selected as part of the official program of the 12th Women's Playwrights International Conference in Montreal. So thanks for being with us, Sophia. Welcome. Pleasure. So let's dive straight in. And I'd really like to start with our own personal experiences of seeing queer women represented in the media, and that could be any media, any platform. So for the first time, what was it for you? And I'd love to know, what impact did it have? So Rebecca, do you want to kick us off?
Absolutely. For me, I have quite a strong memory of what I recall as the first media representation of queer women being, and it was on Ally McBeal. It's a show that I was definitely not allowed to be watching, but I had a little TV in my bedroom. I must have been like 11 or 12, so not really appropriate, but that's okay. Late at night, it it was between Lucy Liu and Callista Flockhart, just seeing the two characters in the show kissing, and that's just like really stuck in my mind as like, wow, okay. And like by that point of seeing that, I already, I knew I was a lesbian. I'd somehow heard the term, I'd identified with it, but it was also like incredibly terrifying. And then I saw this on TV, and I can still like, I think from that time till, maybe when I was like 18, maybe saw like 5 lesbian kisses on TV in that time. And that's really the only representation I did see growing up. So yeah, it had a huge impact, I guess, just seeing that happen in front of me and being like, okay, that's, that is a thing that can happen. So, in a sense, it was positive to see something like that, even in a dramatized version.
That's so interesting, and I might jump in here because my first experience was also a lesbian kiss on TV, and it's really interesting the way that you've described it because it's quite different from my experience. It sounds like that was quite a positive experience.
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. Whereas I grew up in the UK, and there was a show called Brookside. I don't know if it actually aired here in Australia, but in 1994, it was actually the first lesbian kiss that was shown during the sort of daytime, early evening family watching TV. It was Beth Jordak. It was everywhere. It was all across the news. I was 13 years old, and it was not a positive thing. Being a lesbian was not a positive thing. Everybody talked about it. And then she died. So the bury your queers trope was alive and well there. And it wasn't until I was, I think maybe in my 20s that I actually met an actual lesbian. But up until that point, it was definitely not a good thing. So I think that's really interesting that could have that positive impact or a negative impact. So maybe Laura, what was your first experience?
Yeah, look, probably wasn't my first, or maybe it was, but I just remember I think I was home alone. I was not sure how old I was, definitely teens, and ABC telly was on, and I saw this kind of small part of the show, Tipping the Velvet, Sarah Waters. Yeah, I think it was BBC, or they did a television drama version of it, and I was like, I want to watch all of this. Like, this is so sexy. And it was like a much older woman and a younger woman who were having a relationship in the show. But yeah, wow, I was really into that. And then I just tried to watch more episodes of it whenever I could. But yeah, it wasn't like necessarily a typical relationship either within that show, but it was sort of women loving women, which was cool. So
I would put my hand up and say yes, exactly the same thing. Sophia, how about you?
Yeah, I have a different relationship with text and that first feeling of seeing women together. I remember being 10 and watching Home and Away, and it being that plot between Alza Fisher and Rachel Blake. I don't know if anyone else remembers this. And it was so veiled. They were definitely girlfriends, but it was like, I think they touched each other's arm once, and it was really coded and so different. The stuff we started to see around Tipping the Velvet, and then we got the L Word, as flawed as it is, where there started to be like really definite images of women loving women, even with the shit diversity. And I also want to say before I started, I'm so sorry. I wanted to say that I'm zooming in, or whatever this is, from stolen Guringai land, that has never been seeded. And so that experience of watching this really, really coded, veiled story sort of haunted me through till the late 90s, when we started to get crumbs of some actual representation. And I definitely, I was 10 and I was like, these women are into each other, I'm pretty sure, but I'm not sure what that means, and no one's really addressing it properly in this plot, and I'm really stressed. and that sort of like it was really hard to deal with, and it made me feel veiled, and my relationship with text felt veiled, and I spent most of my teens counter reading for stuff that excited me. So probably the thing that most excited me as a teenager was Dating the Enemy, which doesn't have any lesbian plot at all, but I loved watching Claudia Carvin sort of act really butch because she's acting like a man, and that used to just thrill me. And so I think, you know, for my generation, it was counter reading all the way till we got Tipping the Velvet, and then move into some of the stuff this panel is going to cover.
Absolutely. Rima, what was your experience?
Mine wasn't completely positive. I saw Mean Girls with my mum. She took me to the cinemas, and I was like 9 or 10. I think I was 9, and Janice Ian was rumoured to be a lesbian. And I didn't even really know what that word meant at the time. I just had like this kind of sinking feeling, and like just this, I guess, you know, it was portrayed as like, you know, something really gross, and she was disgusting for it. And I remember I came out of the cinema and I was like to my mum, like, oh, like, what's a lesbian? And mum was like, oh, it's like a woman that, you know, loves another woman. And I was like, I just had this sinking feeling just grew and grew. And then like, I was just like, I got to block that because I don't want to be Janice Ian, you know? So that was kind of my experience. And then, later seeing like, the L word, that was really big for me. As you said, like completely flawed in a lot of ways, but still so important to me because pretty much from Janice Ian blank all the way to the L word, which I only watched when I was like 18 or something. So
So it just sounds as if from what everyone's been saying that it's actually this visibility, this representation was so important. Like it was, whether it was negative or positive, it had such a huge impact on sort of each of you that at the time, particularly everything being veiled, it sounds like largely negative experiences.
I think I kind of knew that even like when I saw, you know, that kiss on Ally McBeal, before seeing that, I knew that lesbian was a dirty word. I'd heard my mom and my stepdad talking about Melissa Etheridge, and then, you know, one of them saying, oh, like her music's great, but she's a lesbian. And like, I think that really stuck with me, the way that lesbians are talked about. And like in Mean Girls and, you know, countless other examples, it's always been derided as this kind of other position. And, you know, because lesbians are secondary, you know, in many ways to the way that our society is set up, it's such a rejection of what we see as a compulsory way of life. So I think like hearing everyone's experiences, like it kind of cements that like that has such an impact on how we see ourselves versus like what we are seeing on TV or wherever it is, or what we're reading in a book.
And so that's obviously been some of the focus of your research, this visibility. Can you tell us a bit more about what you've been looking at in your research? What are kind of some of the key things that have come out as most interesting for you?
Totally. So I'm doing my PhD in creative writing. It's creative practice. So my main project is working on a poetry collection. My thesis is focusing on like the intersection of contemporary Australian poetry and the way that lesbians and queer women express themselves on digital media. And I guess that came up for me, you know, a few years ago. I'd had quite a long hiatus off Instagram, downloaded it again, sort of around the time when I guess my book was due to come out. So I was, you know, figuring I'll do a social media thing for my book, and just was incredibly surprised to see all of his lesbian meme accounts, and just like there were so many of them, and you know, there are more and more over time. And seeing that representation and seeing such a stark difference to all of the things that we've, just expressed of, our first time seeing queer women on screen or in text. And so I think for me, like, I just wanted to explore digital life and lesbian expression and how, how those two go together, and I guess what you can do in poetry to express lesbian identity in a way that you are able to express it in digital media.
And have you found that there's been any intersection as well between the poetry and the social media, like and lesbian visibility? Has there been much in that space?
It's definitely, I guess, like probably a burgeoning area of research, and poetry definitely, I think poets of my generation and, much younger than me are like, there are so many examples coming out, not necessarily in poetry collections, but in individual poems that are published that are really kind of playing with our digital life and queer life. And the two texts that I'm focusing on in my thesis are by older poets, Kerry Glastonbury and Pam Brown. And so I'm really looking at how they express queer identity in their poetry, because they're also poets who really engage with digital life and, I guess, question. And I think maybe a lot of it is about, the self and authenticity, performativity, how we express ourselves. And so looking, it's just so interesting to me to see how lesbian identity, queer identity can come through digital media and into poetry.
And Sophia, as a playwright, on that same theme, how do you think that theatre has contributed to lesbian visibility, and how has social media impacted on this?
Look, I'd love to do some proper research into the history of the lesbian in theatre, because I suspect we've and she's been much more present than has been recorded, and that goes back to some of the things we were discussing before we started around the patriarchy. I know when I premiered Bed Party in 2019, it was a play about 5 lesbian women and 1 bisexual woman, and it was a raucous sort of drama/comedy set in a bedroom, a shared house bedroom. And it covered a range of different issues that women in our community experience. And it was a lot of fun, and a lot of people came. And this older lesbian approached me in the foyer after a performance, and she was actually a 78er. And she said to me, "Look, I really, really, really enjoyed tonight. And it reminded me of a play I wrote in the 70s called Shift. And it focused on similar issues." And I was like, wow, I'd really love to read that play. And I had no idea that play existed. And she's like, oh, I lent it to a friend and they never gave it back to me, and I've lost it. And it just really devastated me, because I was like, yeah, of course, women's history not recorded again. And I imagine that in the 70s, there were a bunch of radical lesbian feminists writing really cool plays that we don't know about, because we only know the male canon of theatre. And I've just recently been reading a book about a compilation of lesbian plays by one particular playwright in the States. And, she's tongue-in-cheekly titled it, I've got it here, a slightly well-renowned lesbian playwright, who, again, until I picked it up, I didn't know her work. And we're so dislocated from our own histories as lesbians. Yeah. And we have to sort of find out about it furtively. And so look, my disclosure is I don't know. What I do know is I have the class privilege that has had me going to the theatre most of my life, and I've seen very few lesbian plays, and that's why I wanted to start writing them. And I know that, when we had a brief interlude of being able to go to the theatre in Sydney last year, I saw Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, which again, class privilege, I was able to afford the tickets to go to the STC and see that, and it was so cool to sit in a theatre and see a lesbian story told so well. It was really, really moving. But also, yeah, I felt upset that that is prohibitive to a lot of people, and even indie theatre, as an indie theatre maker, it's still expensive for a lot of people to access. So I do think that to a certain extent, because obviously you still need to be able to have a phone, and there's class issues in that, but I think that social media democratizes representation in a way that classical art forms don't, and I think that that's really important.
That's a really interesting point around sort of the democratization, and I'm just wondering, taking a shift now completely to those social media platforms. They're democratic. Anybody, like you said, with a phone can have one, but they have been criticized for kind of sanitizing the version of lesbians. So I'm thinking particularly of a site that I was looking at just to research for this panel, and it's a lesbian couple they call themselves Wegan. They started blogging, I think, in the early 2010s, and they're what they call themselves a femme lesbian couple, and they vlog, and they now have a lifestyle website, and their Instagram it's beautiful, but it's completely sanitized. And I'm just wondering, Instagram perhaps is separate from TikTok, but I'd be interested to know from each of you, are we just promoting a white cis femme married with kids, suburban lesbians sort of tropes across both of those platforms? Beck, I can see you nodding your head.
If anyone else wants to jump in, I guess there is definitely a homogenization that happens on all social media platforms, especially visual ones like TikTok and Instagram, where I think certain bodies and certain race is held to a different degree, is given more visibility than others. And that is, so while there's so many good things about these platforms, they're also, like everything, also complex and problematic, and there are issues there, just as there are, in every other aspect of society.
Yeah, I think just touching off what Rebecca was saying there, I think the kind of problems that lesbians face in terms of visibility on these mainstream media forms are ones that a lot of communities share, in terms of you don't have to be a lesbian woman to be affected by the fact that it's, skinny white girls that get the majority of space on Instagram. So I think in that way, social media has a lot to answer for, but I wouldn't say that's a particularly lesbian thing. It does obviously have its hands in there, but it's it seeps everywhere in that way.
Absolutely. Laura, did you want to weigh in there?
Yeah. No, I was just thinking when you were talking about the Wegan account, I think you said Wegan, those sanitized, curated, beautiful feeds, that's just something that I think is just a huge problem with platforms like Instagram, but also, people follow those accounts, and it seems to be happening, in different, certainly for queer women, I've seen it as well happening, but also for other groups, it's something that you can find different things on Instagram, and you can follow accounts that don't have a lot of other followers as well, which is cool.
I certainly find that I'm fascinated by it, and I can't almost draw my eyes away, but I don't see myself represented there.
And I think that's the thing as well, because we've been so starved for representation that even when you get something and it's not quite right, or it's it doesn't really live up to your values, you're still going to follow it, and you're still going to grab it. You've got nothing else. I guess that's a similar thing that happened with the L word. You know, like there were a lot of problems, like everyone was super thin and everyone was super gorgeous, but there's nothing else. So you take it because you're just grateful for that speck.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it created an entire lexicon, the L word. I sometimes think of some of the language that I use with my friends and I think, well, where did that come from? I think it came from the L word. Did they get it from somewhere else? I'm sure they did, but absolutely it was all there was. And so we just took it in.
Yeah, I seem to have somehow tripped off my algorithm on Instagram for a certain kind of lesbian account that is actually not necessarily the type of women that I myself am attracted to, and I can't seem to like get it away. They just keep coming up, and it's women that like it's these. They often have sapphic in the username title, whatever, and a lot of these, you know, like lesbian celebrities, but a lot of the celebrities aren't lesbian, and you know, it's strange. It's this really, it feels to me like such a few celebrities that, you know, maybe might be queer and they've just latched onto them, and there's so many accounts and they're all the same. And I'm sure there are other ones, but that just seems to be the ones that I'm getting over and over, and it's kind of, it's not necessarily a good thing. I don't know. For me, it doesn't feel so good. Yeah.
And I might ask you here, Laura, because you've written bisexual characters and you identify as bisexual yourself. Do you find that on these kind of platforms that it offers a space for queer women who don't identify as being lesbian?
Again, I've got this really specific kind of account that I keep seeing, which is like it seems to be sort of celebrities that people are attracted to, female celebrities that, but they're not necessarily lesbian. So I think it's kind of, I like that there are just accounts that are about women having things and crushes and being in love with women. That's cool. That makes me feel connected to that part of myself. But it still feels really simplified. And I think like those kinds of accounts being there might mean that then we can all have our own personal representation of how we define our own queerness, and we can put that out there. But these accounts that I'm seeing, they're very, there's no nuance to it. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Well, it sounds very much a little bit like what we've been talking about with the L word, is that it's this kind of amalgamation. It's the thing that gets put out to the world, but it's very much a kind of a blob of what being a lesbian or being a queer woman is, to be presented to the world, and it doesn't even begin to represent the nuances, like you said. And I suppose that goes to the question of visibility. When we say visibility and we want to promote, say, lesbian visibility, or what exactly are we talking about? Do we mean visible to us, or do we mean visible to the rest of the world? What do you think? Sophia, I might jump to you on this one.
Yeah, I think both are really important for the reasons we were talking about earlier, with how important those morsels of representation were to us when we first watched Ally McBeal or Home and Away, whether negative or positive. We definitely need it for us, because we need to feel as though we are seeing ourselves, and that's the frustration I'm sensing when I'm hearing my fellow panelists describe not exactly seeing yourself in some of the accounts you're coming across. We need to understand as humans that we're not alone, and we need, as especially in our formative years, to help to shape our sense of self. We need that representation, and to be fed back to us that that's positive and not negative, and something to be excited about and not afraid of. So definitely for ourselves, but also, yeah, absolutely. I think we want the world to know we exist and that we're not scary, and that we won't overhear conversations in years to come of parents saying she's a good singer but she's a lesbian. And visibility normalizes, and normalizes a vexed word. I'm not sure I ever want to be normal, but normalizing the sense that it's something that is okay. So I think that's why we want to be seen and not erased. And we've been routinely erased and forgotten and given a lack of specificity for decades, forever. And I think there are so many different ways to identify as women who love women, and obviously there's so many different specificities of what loving women means, and all those complexities need to be available, and I think it's both ways. We need it for us, so we need to be able to access ourselves, and we need people to be able to understand us and be comprehensible.
Yeah, totally. I think like jumping off that with the wanting to be able to have both, like wanting to be able to be like represented in mainstream media, and then also having like, lesbian content that is by us and for us. Like, for example, on TikTok, like I put in a lot of work to have the algorithm that I have. Like I specifically like videos and specifically swipe through others so that I have an algorithm that like I'm quite proud of. But I think in that, like, do I expect, a 35-year-old man on TikTok to be watching teen lesbian videos? No. And do I want to watch, like, I don't know, whatever he would be watching? Probably not either. So I think, like, the question of visibility is kind of different when you're talking about personal social media as, like, mainstream media.
Yeah, and those algorithms are really... Oh, sorry, you go, Rebecca.
Oh, no, I was just going to kind of agree with all of that. And I think, just echoing what you both said, it is really important to have both. And I think for ourselves, we're looking at our phone, we're looking at our Instagram, our TikTok, whatever, and to have that specificity, that, what we like, what we want to see is represented back at us. That is important because it's, I guess, affirming and validating our identity for ourselves. And then, if it has a wider impact, that's great. And I feel like with social media, like, I think because of the accessibility of it, I think surely it must kind of leak out into society in some ways. Well, I'm at least hoping, it's not just lesbians looking at lesbian content. It's kind of, as Sophia said, normalizing that to an extent.
It does occur to me, though, now that we're talking, that it's like, of course, this stuff, social media is so, like, you personalize it. So, yes, I guess there can be lesbian visibility, queer women visibility on social media, but if that's the only place, that can't be enough and isn't okay. And it's like it's again doing that thing where you have to find it yourself and you have to seek it out rather than it just, because on social media, your explore page is what you like. It's not giving you a representation of the whole of society, I guess. Yeah. So it's like, it has to be more than just TikTok and Instagram. That there are lesbians and queer women, just they should be everywhere and in everything, because in real life that's the case. So, yeah.
No, that's a really good point, Lauren. And maybe let's talk for a second about these algorithms that present us with content, because I look at content and I suppose my automatic assumption is that other people are seeing similar content to me. And then I remember that there are probably people out there whose content is entirely filled with cars and dogs maybe, and they don't see any lesbian content at all. And that kind of blows my mind. And that's a very kind of me-centric world. But my understanding of some of these algorithms, particularly on TikTok, is that they're looking at your facial expression and somehow through some kind of technological magic, they can see your facial expression in your eyes and actually then continue to feed you content that you are reacting positively to. Now, is that going to have an impact on who sees this lesbian content, just like you said, Laura?
Wow. I did not know they used like the face recognition technology. I thought it was about like the number of times you watched something or like whether you liked it. But of course they would use that. Yeah, that's incredible to me. But yeah, I think like in terms of it being a thing of your own, a personal thing, I think that can kind of be a strength. But it does concern me to think of like how much how bubbled our worlds are when you think like, oh, all these things that I'm seeing, everyone's seeing, and reality is not at all, you know. No, it's crazy. It's so personalized today. Everything is so personalized because we're so connected to constantly giving data. And to think that that's had an impact on the queer community is incredible.
I think it's kind of interesting you say that about the bubble of, you know, our personalized social media. And for me, it's quite stark when I live in Brisbane at the moment, but I grew up in southwestern Sydney and my family still live there. So when I go home to visit my family, like I'm out of my bubble. Like I'm very kind of visible in that I don't look anything like anyone else. And so I think like maybe for a lot of us, when we're outside of our personal social media bubble, we can be either really invisible or really hyper visible. And I feel like lesbians and queer women have always faced that challenge of being very visible to some people, but at the same time not being seen at all because we don't subscribe to the way that, you know, we're expected to look or act.
Yeah.
So in terms of that visibility, I think there have been periods where there have been trends where lesbians have kind of come into the mainstream media for sort of pockets of time, if you like. So I'm thinking of the kind of 90s lesbian chic. And it's like, you know, lesbians come in and out of fashion. And I'm just wondering, where are lesbians now? And do we still have much less visibility than, say, cis gay men? And is social media actually helping with this? Sophia, what do you think?
Look, I think we do, but I don't want to pit my community against gay men because I think they've got their own oppressions they're facing also, and the sort of the extra gains they have because they're men in terms of having more shows or whatever. I don't begrudge them it. You know, gay men aren't my enemy, but yeah, I think we do come in and out of vogue, and when we come into vogue, it's usually look, I was a kid in the 90s, but looking back on how it sort of felt, it was our salaciousness and our you know, where we sat in the male gaze that made that fun for Madonna to be a bit bi, or no. And look, I don't want to invisibilize Madonna's biness. That's really unfair. You know what I'm trying to say? Where it was kind of sexy to like women for a bit, and it's not so much anymore. I think some of that was to do with where we were situated with heterosexual men, and that's really upsetting. And I think that I don't know. I don't think we're as interesting to them as them at the moment. So in a way, that's good, and the content is being driven by us and for us. But of course, we're not the ones in those power structures. So you know, most of the time we're doing our art in indie spheres and not in the mainstream spheres because of socioeconomics, and women generally have less money than men. so while we'll occasionally have, you know, some really decent mainstream representation explode, flawed or not, it's few and far between. You get your L words, and your pockets of successful writers like Sarah Waters, and then the rest of us slog it out and have 5 jobs to try and make the art that we're making, that we share with our communities and is really meaningful. Sorry, I'm being really
Totally.
impressive.
No, I think that's really accurate in that it's looking at it from like the perspective of the male gaze is really interesting. And I think we have progressed in a lot of ways in terms of like the number of lesbians that are visible today. Like we've got, you know, Cara Delevingne, Sarah Paulson, Kristen Stewart, like the list goes on now of these like A-list hot celebrities that are lesbian. But again, like if you look at like the kind of person that is, you know, is it a POC woman? Is it someone that is a bigger bodied person? Those sorts of questions, which I think are questions everywhere at the moment, are really relevant. But I definitely do think there are a lot more lesbians around, and you don't have to look that hard anymore.
Yeah, after my novel Cherry Beach came out, or when people were reading it, even for the blurbs, a number of times I was told that what I'd done was brave, because the protagonist of Cherry Beach is a lesbian, and she has her first relationship in the book, and yeah, it's an interesting kind of thing to hear, and also, you know, balancing wanting to write a book that the main character is gay, a gay woman, and for that not to be a big deal, but also to not ignore that and try to sort of make that invisible when we were doing publicity. And it was like a really fine line, because I didn't want the book to just be about the fact that she was gay, but I didn't want the book to pretend that this wasn't a book about someone who was gay, so that more people would buy it or something. You know, people might, you know, buy it who wouldn't have bought it if it was, if they'd known that. Or so it's just, it was tricky to, and I didn't get like a lot of say in that stuff, but it's kind of, I guess, yeah, I want there to just be more books with novels with gay women in them, to the point where this doesn't have to be a thing. It doesn't have to be that this is an LGBTI book, QTI book. This is just a book, a novel about a woman, but also it's important. Like, we can't ignore that that's not already a thing. And yeah, it's tricky. I don't know. I could go on about it for a while.
I think that's a really good point, Laura. Just in terms of, like, I've often thought about bookshops and how some of them have a queer section, and, you know, there's obviously lots of crossover between what's in the queer section and what, you know, would just be in general fiction, poetry, non-fiction, etc. And, like, it's sort of about, like, you need the balance, and you need both of those things, because, like, just thinking about my experience when I just came out, I think it was 19, and I went to Newtown in Sydney for the first time, and I went to Elizabeth's Books, which is a secondhand bookshop, and they had a queer shelf, kind of like tucked, you know, it was like tucked at the back of the store like they usually are. And it was a small shelf, but I found Dorothy Porter on there, I found Michelle T on there, like these books that absolutely, like, changed my life. And, like, if they hadn't have been on that shelf, I never would have found them. And so it's like, we want, you know, like, why not have both shelves, you know, you know, we want people to know this is a queer book, but it's also a book. And I guess maybe that's, like, about queer people in general. Like, we are this thing, but we're also just humans. We're just, you know, we are like everyone else in that sense.
Yeah, we were talking about this in the last kind of, sorry. talking about this in the last panel, and we suggested that we'd have 2 copies of every book so that then we could put them on both shelves. Sorry, Joanna.
No, I was just gonna say I had exactly the same experience going to Foyles on Charing Cross Road in London. It was my mecca. It was such a treat to go there and just kind of spend half an hour just browsing the surprisingly large section at the time for me, because I didn't see it anywhere else. So it reminds me as well. So we've been talking about that balance between wanting to call something out as being queer and wanting it just to be normal. And it reminds me, there was a TV show, I think it was on Netflix recently, called Lady Parts, and there was a queer character. And what struck me most about it, and maybe it shouldn't have struck me, but the queer character fell in love with another woman, and no one mentioned the fact that she was queer. They were just mocking her because she was going all gooey over a girl, just the same as if she'd been going all gooey over a boy. And I just remember thinking it was so great, but it did really strike me that it was quite unusual that it was just a storyline. It was just another storyline. It wasn't a queer storyline. And I think that
I think it was a queer storyline because there was fear around her coming out, being part of that article. So I agree, within her friendship circle, it was irrelevant. Her sexuality was irrelevant, and that was refreshing. But I think there were still elements of what being publicly out means. And it was especially interesting with those intersections of faith and culture, I thought, and that there was already tension in what they were doing as a band of Muslim women.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. That was certainly an element of that sort of coming out. I think what I really liked was just the fact, particularly like you said, within her circle of friends, it's been so rare to see these depictions in literature and in TV screenwriting and other genres of someone being queer, and it's not sort of this huge deal. It's like they have a life, they have relationships, they have a job, and they're queer, and they're a lesbian, and they're a however they identify. And I'm thinking, is that something that we want to start seeing more? Is that the desired kind of outcome for visibility?
Yeah, I would say it is. I would say I think it's a mix of what we were talking about before, in terms of that is what we want in terms of visibility, but also it needs to step up in the kinds of lesbians that are represented and the kinds of people that are represented. So to have these stories, sure. And that's what I think I really, personally, I want to see a lot more Indigenous queer women being represented. And so there's other questions that come into it in terms of the other life stories. And I think that's been a big problem with queer representation, is that it's always been the coming out story and running away from home and all of these really tragic events happening in their life. And so, as you say, in terms of having a job and a life and creative dreams and all of those sorts of things, that's what we want to see with visibility. But again, it needs to be better than what it is.
I think that, again, we need both. I think that, I think that, of course, lesbian women are people, and we live fairly ordinary lives, and that needs to be represented. And there are stories where our sexuality is entirely irrelevant, and those stories need to be told. And it's such an important normalizing tool. But I do also think that until we live in the utopia, which sadly is a fair way off, I can absolutely see things getting better in certain areas in terms of what it is to come out, and that it is an absolute non-event for a lot of young queer kids coming out nowadays. But there there are still families and areas where it is incredibly torturous and incredibly unsafe, and suicides and risk of suicide and depression. And until everyone is safe, coming out is still a really tense thing for a lot of people. And to say that we just want to move away from storytelling, that we never handle coming out again. I've never wrote a coming out story, like, just as full disclosure, but I don't like that disavowal we sometimes slip into, where we never want to talk about coming out or any of the hard stuff about being queer, because we're more than the hard stuff. Because some of the hard stuff has shaped us, and in some of the stuff we described at the start of this panel of how hard it was to be little and not feel represented, seeing people survive the hard stuff is an important part of storytelling too. I don't think all our stories should be about that, but I don't think we should ever disavow those stories, because when they're told well, they're really powerful and really beautiful. I remember really loving watching David's coming out in 6 Feet Under when I was a teenager, and watching that movement of that story of him and Keith. And not having those stories, I think, would be a real grief. Can we have that, please?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think it's about it's just about being able to have both, because it does make you feel kind of pigeonholed when it's just coming out and just these kind of tragic stories. Like, I want people to know, the creative talents and just the amazing achievements people have in their life, and those things are worth celebrating and enjoying. But I also am not ready to, I personally am not even ready to take away like the hard stuff about my journey and not include that in my writing. I am going to include that, because that's the reality for me of what being gay has looked like. And I think, Laura, before, when you were talking about this balance that you were doing in terms of having it being a big mention that your character was a lesbian or not, it's still, I do want to note that, because I am a lot less likely to read something that has a straight character than I am that has a queer character. Like, I do want to know, because I'm going to be reading that, because I still haven't had enough of it to feel like I could just casually be able to pick and choose between the books that are available. Like, I need to know what stuff is queer, because it's still not represented enough that I have to go searching for it.
So this might be a good time to look back at then the social media platforms. And in terms of this increased visibility, Sophia, you were just talking about sort of, I guess, well-being, mental health around young people. This increased visibility that we have, what impact do you think it's had on young queers in terms of identity, shame, mental health, pride? What are your thoughts on that?
I really don't know. I'm not qualified to answer, but it gives me a lot of hope that there are more images out there, and I don't think that can hurt. I think listening to you guys discuss the ways that it is still, there's still a body fascism and a one type of lesbian being sort of funneled through these algorithms is upsetting. Full disclosure, and I think it's probably naughty of me to mention this at the end, I'm not on any social media. But I think in terms of the focus of the panel, I felt I could be here today and speak about the ways that traditional platforms have failed, being in a traditional platform of playwriting. And I do watch my girlfriend on her TikTok a lot, and she's it's meant a lot to her mental health to be able to see people that she enjoys. And I think for her, it's just slice of life stuff that she seems to really enjoy, and just feeling like there's a community out there. And so my hope is that younger people can find those communities too and not feel alone. But I realized that was quite an optimistic way to a thing to hope for social media, and you guys have darkened that a little bit for me with all the talks of the stereotypes. But look, there being something accessible, I think there's got to be hope in that.
Totally. Just chiming in, obviously I don't know full statistics, but I think something I read recently, and this was like an American kind of focus study that was like you know, 1 in 5 people of the Gen Z generation identify as LGBTQ. So like even kind of seeing those kind of statistics, and you're like, people, you know, it seems like younger people feel so much freer to identify with different genders, different sexualities. And, you know, I think I imagine social media has a lot to do with that in terms of what they're seeing and what they feel comfortable sharing. And if you see your community, you know, in front of you on your phone, like if you can find your community and see people who look like you or have, you know, the same desires as you, like that's going to have a massive effect on your mental health. And if I like think about if I was young, and like in many ways I'm glad that social media wasn't really around when I was a teenager, because I think that would have been disastrous for my mental health. But like to, I guess, have access to a lesbian community would have like absolutely changed my life in high school.
Yeah, I'm the same. Like, just for me, absolutely so thankful that there was not Instagram and TikTok when I was a teenager. It would have been terrible. It's even terrible for me now, for my mental health. But I didn't want to be attracted to women or to love women. Like, I was ashamed of it, and I tried to stop it from being a thing for so many years, and just, you know, I just think surely it has to be helpful to be able to curate your own personal, you know, seeing, because as we say, your social media is yours, but we can see as young people, they must be seeing that there are so many different ways of loving, and it's you're just so not alone, and it's not a dirty or a bad thing. It's like a wonderful, cool thing. Yeah. So I just think it must be, positive in some ways, as you guys have said. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my experience has been, I think it sounds quite similar. I'm not like a huge user, but what I do is I go back to myself at 13 and I think, okay, maybe it wouldn't have been so great to be seeing all these sanitized images, but I know that it certainly would have been really comforting to know that there were other people out there who felt the same way as me, and that I could connect with as well. I mean, there are so many stories of people actually saying they're rejecting dating apps. There aren't any queer spaces that they can go to, but social media platforms where they can find people and start friendships, develop relationships. I think that would have been hugely welcome when I was a teenager. But in another space, I think it's really positive for younger queer women to be able to find their peers. But I've also had conversations with friends of a similar age to me. I'm in my early 40s. One particular friend said that she's always identified as a lesbian. Now she's gone down a lot of TikTok wormholes, and she's actually found herself questioning her lesbian identity and realizing how many other options there are out there that were never available to her previously. And I thought that was really interesting, that could be an impact as well of TikTok, particularly in terms of actually changing identity, and people actually being able to explore all the different options that, you know, where else would we find out about that?
Mm. Totally. Totally.
So in terms of then, I mean, we've talked a little bit about language. I'm just wondering whether you have any thoughts on how particularly TikTok might have impacted on the language that we use. We talked earlier about the L word, and, you know, that's where we got a lot of our language perhaps in the sort of early 2000s. But is it also potentially creating a divide between sort of younger lesbians who are in one particular platform and those who are still kind of looking at more traditional platforms? I'm wondering, Beck, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, totally. I guess, like, as you kind of opened the panel with asking, you know, do you listen to Girl in Red? You know, I'd read so many articles about this kind of like, who is Girl in Red, and like I'm not on TikTok, but sort of see enough queer media to kind of, you know, have it filtered through what I read and look at. And yeah, just like it's so interesting that these kind of like, you know, I guess that's more of a like maybe not so much a textual language, but, you know, visual language and signifiers. And that's like, you know, I guess like, you know, an earlier version of that would be, you know, do listen to Tegan and Sarah, do listen to Tracy Chapman, Katie Lang, that kind of thing. So it is interesting, like seeing how that evolves through different generations. And, you know, for the younger generation, Girl in Red seems to be what they're flocking to. And like people like King Princess, like even I love King Princess, but even if that makes me feel slightly old when like King Princess's like fans all seem to be quite young. Yeah.
So just to explain to anyone in the audience who is not familiar with the Girl in Red reference, it's, I believe, a Norwegian singer, and I don't know exactly, you know, these things happen how they happen. It's become a reference, a language for young queer people to actually let other lesbians or women who like women know that they're also queer. So you ask someone, you know, do you listen to the Girl in Red? And if they say yes, or they know what you're talking about, then, you know, it's kind of like a safe platform to explore. So yeah, I'm just wondering, yeah, is that a positive thing? Rima, what do you think?
Yeah, I think totally. I don't know, I think like with social media, like there are so many like generational differences, you know, like for example, like my nan is on Facebook, but is she on TikTok? No. So when we're talking about social media as a whole, I don't really think it's often not very useful because social media, all the different platforms are so different and have such different demographics on it. Like I was kind of coming out in the time that like Tumblr lesbians were a really big thing. And like I actually met my first girlfriend on Tumblr, you know, which is like a really classic lesbian story. So I think, yeah, there's generational differences that come into social media use, and then there's generational differences that come into queer labeling as well. So for example, I don't see many younger lesbians using terms like stone butch. That seems like quite dated now. Instead, it's more mask. Would be like the equivalent that seems to be used on TikTok a lot. So I think like the labels have changed with time, and you can see that in social media as well, especially when you're on younger platforms, social media. And then I think as well, like the impact of time in being like more accepting of diversity and more accepting of like inclusivity, that being like a big thing for Generation Z as well. So yeah, I guess like I believe like, yeah, social media for the most part has encouraged fluidity with labels, especially with the younger platforms like TikTok, because yeah, you see like Gen Z is so playful a lot of the time with this attitude that they even like try to counteract lesbian norms. Like there's this one trend that it's called normalizing masks in bikinis. So it's like got this music and it's like, you know, kind of like player mask looking kind of person, and then it's like bam, looking really like in like a little bikini in the pool, and like that's normally something that just femmes would wear. And then there's like another one which is like another trend which is you only like femmes, boom, and then they change into looking like really femme. And like in my time, it was like if you were femme, like you dressed femme every day. If you were butch, you dressed butch every day. It wasn't like, oh, each day I can change it up and be what I want to do. So I really, really like that. I think it's really incredible because it's so much more fluid, like within an identity itself. It's like you can be whatever you want, whenever you want. And like, to be honest as well, like I want to put big recognition here on the impact of gender on that, and like how much like trans people and non-binary people have done to make that more comfortable as well. So yeah, I think that's the really greatest thing about social media in that way. It's just, yeah, a lot more fluid, and you see that with the young ones a lot, and I'm like so excited for them. have that.
That's a really beautiful note for us to wrap up on, because unfortunately we are almost out of time. What I would love to hear is, you mentioned earlier on about a utopia, Sophia. I'd love to hear in one sentence, if you can, each, what would be your lesbian visibility utopia on any platform? So Sophia, do you want to kick us off? You've already shared a bit about it.
No, that's so hard. But there'd be a lot of women there, and we'd have a really good time.
Rebecca, how about you?
I guess like taking mine out into real life, my kind of lesbian utopia, which is quite specific, is walking into a clothing store and there not being gendered clothing. Like that to me would be incredible. No women's, no men's, no nothing. Just you walk in, you don't feel uncomfortable, you don't feel looked at, you don't feel any shame. That's kind of like my very normal version of utopia.
Laura, how about you?
Yeah, I'm just thinking like, I mean, this is, definitely utopia, but when I think a world where a young, you could come out when and how you wanted to, whatever age, whatever you're feeling about who you are, you could just say it. And I don't know, just explore that, and less secrets around all of that stuff that I think so many people still feel they have to keep. And that would be cool. Yeah.
Thanks, Laura. And Rima?
Oh, I think Laura just kind of reminded me as well, like with what you were saying about when and where and how and all of that. And I kind of like, I love the idea as well of being able to change. And I think that's kind of what we were talking about before with like being mentioned that someone realized, their identity, they watch these TikToks and their identity kind of changed, like being able to kind of constantly evolve. I guess that's my like visibility dream. And also to see like, hundreds of really creative, intelligent lesbians on TV. But yeah, I think just being able to like constantly evolve and be able to like, because that's a reality for a lot of people, is like that they've changed a lot even within their identity. But I'll keep it short. So that's it.
Oh, well, I can tell you that my lesbian visibility utopia is having this panel session with all of you and being able to talk with incredible queer women about our visibility. And so that brings us to the end of the panel. It actually brings us to the end of the 2021 EnQueer Festival. So I just want to say thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, Rebecca Jessen, Laura McPhee-Browne, Rima Martens, and Sophia Davidson Gluyas. And thank you everyone who's been involved in making the first EnQueer Festival possible. And lastly, thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Stay queer. Good night.